experienced a number of economic downturns in my professional life. I'll date myself a little bit here, but as a young attorney in New York, I experienced the savings and loan crisis of the late 80s and the early 90s, which was also coupled with the junk bond crisis. We also went through, I had a business and during 9/11 and felt the impact of that. By the time the whole real estate debacle came along, I felt like I was an old pro at weathering the storm through these crises. But this is looking and feeling very different. How's this impacting like communities like Baltimore? Because a lot of times when we talk about the stock market, for those of us who may not have anything in the stock, we don't understand how this might impact the local communities. So what have you been seeing in your work in Baltimore in terms of the impact of this crisis from a financial perspective?
It's a very interesting question because, again, most of my work happens in communities that were already in distress and have been for generations, right? So it's the old adage that if, white people get a cold, we get pneumonia. All of us are kind of sort of in the stock market in some capacity because we are part of a stream of markets that are deeply influencing each other. Baltimore is a city where you can see in relief the history of structural racism quite in evidence, right? It's actually manifested itself in the environment currently because it's really the only city that hasn't been, especially in an urban core, it hasn't been massively gentrified. So you have extremely wealthy neighborhoods right next door to extremely poor neighborhoods in a city that's 70% Black and brown, but still experiencing 25, 35, 45% unemployment, depending on where you choose to place your gaze. So I think one of the things that we are looking at in the current crisis, because the multiple assaults that have happened that suppress Black agency in a city like Baltimore happen in every sector, right? So essentially, Baltimore is already a manifestation of what the world is experiencing because we are deeply traumatized, deeply damaged in healthcare, food, housing, education, the law, transit, and so on and so on. And those things are still made manifest because the urban removal that happened in most urban centers hasn't really happened en masse here. I'm from Washington, D.C. My production company is based in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. I worked in Harlem for 30 years, Northern and Southern California, Dallas. So Baltimore's my seventh city doing this work in. And we were gentrified out of all of those cities because basically working with artists, I build theaters and galleries and restaurants and those kinds of things, and basically we're renting. And so the second we light up a corridor or a corner, then the landlord finds out kind of sort of how much we were making and pegs the new rent, $4,000 over that. So, my brother and I opened up an art gallery in a performance space in Emeryville, California, in an abandoned corridor that was an industrial zone. Pixar Animation moves in across the street from us and expands rapidly. And our rent went from $7,000 to $21,000 a month in one jump.
Wow.
So basically it's like whatever you can't afford, that's your new rent. So one of the things that we're seeing here on the ground is that Baltimore has a ton of distressed, very beautifully architecturally laid out city, very well designed city, but because of the generations on top of generations of discrimination, they're kind of locked in a permanent underclass. And we've seen that in many other places, of course, but that underclass is for the most part, like I grew up in Washington, D.C., they've been removed. You just don't see them downtown. It was like, I was at a meeting down there, it was like 30 minutes before I saw a Black man in a suit in neighborhoods that I had worked in as a young person. So we haven't seen the full effect of this global meltdown on these communities yet, but they're already distressed, they're already addicted. All the things that lead directly from like racism equals poverty, like the end, you don't need a deeper explanation of that. you can still find that manifest quite powerfully, visibly in Baltimore.